Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the stream. We're going to be doing a little bit of commentary. We're going to switch it up today. But I saw this article on Twitter, Capcom versus SNK, an oral history, and it's by Polygon. Really good write-up. It was written by Matt Leone, or Matt Leon. Not sure how to pronounce the last name. Very good article. With quotes from the directors and stuff, a little bit of the history of what happened, in the 90s, up to the point of Capcom versus SNK 2. Starts out with the title, Capcom versus SNK, an oral history. We continue our Street Fighter history series with a look at Capcom, partnered with its crosstown rival. So I'll start the article, and I'm just going to read it all the way through. For those that don't want to read the article, that is what this is for. The late 90s weren't kind to arcade fighting games. When Street Fighter director Takashi Nishiyama left Capcom for SNK in the late 80s, he set in motion a series of events that built the fighting game genre and gave a much-needed jolt to the amusement industry. For a few years, everyone forgot about the business' gradual downward trajectory, thanks to games like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. By the late 90s, though, the industry momentum caught up to it, while games like Tekken 3 and Marvel vs. Capcom kept appearances. The business was changing. Console games were exploding, the fighting game boom was over, and Capcom and SNK arcade divisions were left trying to scrap the last pieces of candy out of the piñata. Fortunately for Capcom, it had managed to grow its console game division, in the meantime finding success with the Resident Evil series, among others. SNK failed to find the same level of success outside of fighting games, trying its hand at a seedy version of its Neo Geo home console, new 3D arcade hardware, and a Neo Geo Pocket series of portable game machines. Nishiyama, who served as the head of SNK's development group, says this marked a tough time for him personally. In part because he was opposed to the release of the Neo Geo Pocket, which SNK invested in heavily. Soon after, SNK got acquired and filed for bankruptcy, and Nishiyama left and started his own independent studio. But before departing, he left behind a parting gift, one that neatly tied a bow on his past decade. And here you see Capcom/SNK crossover resulted in 8 games between 1999 and 2007, not counting ports or the second of the Pokemon-style twin versions of SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters Clash. Mending Fences. Often friendly, occasionally contentious, rooted in executive frustration, yet resembling a playground flirtation. The rivalry between Capcom and SNK played out in many forms throughout the 80s and 90s. Privately, many spoke of a feud between Capcom's CEO, Kenzo Tsujimoto, and SNK founder Eikichi Kawasaki, while publicly, fans saw the companies trying to top one another while constantly referring or referencing each other in their games. Capcom and SNK spent the 90s in a kind of call and response dance, says veteran fighting game developer Seth Killian. Capcom had Ryu, so SNK made Ryo. He says, Street Fighter added a parry, SNK introduced the Just Defend. You got T-Hawk, we got T-Zoc. Nishiyama sat in the middle of this, having developed the original Street Fighter at Capcom before joining SNK and overseeing the Fatal Fury and King of Fighters series. While he didn't directly participate much in the back and forth, he couldn't help but notice it. And in the late 90s, he hatched an idea to bring his franchise together. What if the two companies put all this history to good use? And then we have a few quotes here from a few developers. Noritaka Funamizu, general producer at Capcom Japan. The way the idea came up to begin with was because Nishiyama, I think, and Capcom head development Yoshiki Okamoto had lunch or dinner together one day, and then out of the blue, Nishiyama suddenly said, "Yeah, why don't we make a versus SNK game?" Another quote by Takashi Nishiyama, head development of SNK Japan. The way this came about was Okamoto had become the top of Capcom's development division and had been the top of SNK development division. And we ended up meeting one day. We talked about putting the past behind us. And the idea came up of combining our forces and using each of our company's characters in collaborative project. And Okamoto thought that the idea was very interesting. So I told Okamoto to convince Sugimoto to make that happen. I would convince Kawasaki to make it happen. I think this discussion happened right before I ended up quitting SNK. Actually, it wasn't that difficult to convince Kawasaki. I think you could say they'd put the past behind them. Kawasaki was a businessman, so I think he realized there was a lot of potential to benefit from this kind of collaboration. And then you have Matt Atwood at Capcom vs SNK, public relations manager. He was working at Capcom USA. I remember thinking, like, really? SNK? I always thought it was crazy that these two rivals were actually working together. Another quote from Toyoisa Tanabe. This is the pixel art supervisor from SNK Japan that worked on Capcom vs SNK. I was extremely surprised but also extremely happy. Another one by Takayuki Nakayama, Street Fighter V director of Capcom Japan. I was definitely surprised. Capcom's first crossover game came out prior to me joining the company, but I was excited when I saw the announcement where characters like Terry and Kyo were presented in Capcom pixel art style. I've heard that both Capcom and SNK graphic artists were in touch prior to the release of the game. And then I have a quote here by Noritaka Funamizu, general producer of Capcom Japan. Before we started talking with SNK about a project, Tanabe, planner Hideki Itsuno, and I had started hanging out together. And it was a few months later that the whole SNK versus Capcom thing came up. So yeah, I think we were getting along pretty well by then. Another quote by Toyohisa Tanabe, Capcom vs SNK pixel art supervisor. At the time, it's not as if SNK and Capcom never talked to each other or anything, but I had the impression that there was some bad blood between the two. When I heard Capcom and SNK would be collaborating, it felt like, spring is here. Like there was a thawing of relations between the two companies. For me personally, it previously felt kind of difficult to approach people at Capcom. But thanks to the collaboration, I got to know the people there. Our relationship improved and we would go out drinking together and stuff. We used to do these Capcom vs SNK drinking parties together. Aside from drinking, you know, the card game Yu-Gi-Oh, right? That was actually quite popular back in the day. And there were a lot of people at SNK who loved playing it. They would play during their lunch breaks. For example, it turned out there were Yu-Gi-Oh fans at Capcom as well. So we ended up throwing Capcom vs SNK Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments. And you have another by Matt Atwood, Capcom vs SNK public relations manager from Capcom USA. I think it was a good opportunity for SNK because they were starting to quiet down some where Capcom had been able to hold its own and do series behind Street Fighter. And really, SNK was really starting to slide. You had the arcade folks who were like, yeah, of course we remember SNK games. We love them. But broader appeal, they didn't know these characters. And I have another quote from Toyohisa Tanabe, Capcom vs. SNK Pixel Art Supervisor. I wasn't directly involved in the negotiations or the process that led to them collaborating, so I don't know anything about it for sure, but I think it might have been the release of the Neo Geo Pocket that led the two companies initially collaborating. When SNK decided that they were going to release the handheld system, they approached various companies to see if anyone would develop games for it. I think the company spoke with Capcom at the time. I think it was those conversations which sparked the idea to create a game with licensed characters from both Capcom and SNK. So on the SNK side, there was SNK vs. Capcom on the Neo Geo Pocket, which was a card game, and on the Capcom side there was Capcom vs. SNK, which was the fighting game. I'm not sure, but I think that's how it all got started. And then this last quote here from Takashi Nishiyama, Head Development Group, SNK Japan. I don't think everything was necessarily decided in that initial agreement. It proceeded more gradually, step by step. It was like building up a new business, and we had to figure out precisely who would do that. Alright, now we're going to get into Capcom versus SNK. With an initial agreement in place, both companies planned out their crossover games. SNK kicked things off in 1999 with two titles for its Neo Geo Pocket Color, which is a card game, SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters Clash, and fighting game, SNK vs. Capcom Match of the Millennium. Both earned critical acclaim and fleshed out the portable consoles library to help it compete with that of Nintendo's Game Boy. Though some players wondered why SNK didn't initially produce an arcade fighting game, in 2001 SNK followed with a Card Fighters Clash sequel, which ended up being the final Neo Geo Pocket Color game. As SNK gave up its portable console ambitions, Capcom, meanwhile, went straight to its bread and butter in 2000 with Capcom vs. SNK, a 2D arcade fighting game running on the same hardware as Capcom's hit Marvel vs. Capcom 2. The concept proved popular around Capcom offices, with some staff like planner Itsuno begging to work on it. To accommodate multiple styles of play, Capcom developed a ratio system, where players could build a team of fighters of different strengths, and a groove system where players could choose between Street Fighter and King of Fighters playstyles. It was the game fans expected from the Capcom/SNK collaboration, with a few caveats. And we move on to some more quotes by the producers and other developers, people who worked on it. Noritaka Funamizu, general producer at Capcom Japan. I had heard of King of Fighters, and just from the title, I had my own impressions of what kind of game it would be. It sounded really cool. The Neo Geo had all these different fighting games, so wouldn't it be great if you mix all their strengths together in one single game? That's what I imagined King of Fighters to be. But when I actually played it, it turned out to be totally different. So when we were making Capcom vs. SNK, I wanted to make it more like the King of Fighters I had imagined in my head. I have another quote by Seiji Okada, Capcom vs. SNK series programmer from Capcom Japan. I actually had never played an SNK game before, so I had no knowledge about anything, or even the names of the characters in the game. So I had to do a lot of research for that. At first impression, the way the gameplay felt totally different from Capcom's fighting games, which was refreshing. And then we got one from James Chen, FAQ writer. He wrote the series on the Capcom vs. SNK. CVS definitely felt like it was more Street Fighter than the King of Fighters. Because even though there was the SNK groove, it wasn't very good. For the most part, it felt like the SNK characters were put into a Street Fighter game. I have another quote here, Stephen Frost from the Street Fighter 30th anniversary and the SNK 40th anniversary producer at Digital Clips. I think the SNK characters played better than they had in previous games. If you can say that, right? I think they handled a bit better. They felt a little bit more responsive in comparison to how they had in the past. So I thought they blended in well, and I thought the developers found a nice middle ground between matching Street Fighter and the SNK stuff. Toyoisha Tanabe, Capcom vs SNK pixel art supervisor of SNK Japan. I thought Capcom's staff liked SNK characters and handled them with great care. I felt they poured a lot of love into the pixel work they did for them. According to what I heard, when they were making Capcom vs SNK, the Capcom designers were all vying for the opportunity to design certain characters. Let me design Yori Yagami. Give me my. So no, I wouldn't say that it was hard to blend together or anything. I think SNK felt comfortable putting these characters in the hands of the Capcom designers. And then another quote by James Chen. Man, the SNK characters looked awesome. It was refreshing to see the characters look so cool. It was also just really awesome that it was actually made. That this finally happened, this dream match, after all the Dan jokes and the Yuri clapbacks from SNK. And it was really just cool to see these two companies that had this rivalry finally coming together and making a game like this. I have a quote here by Toyohisa Tanabe, pixel art supervisor of SNK Japan. I had worked on the King of Fighters games at SNK, and those were kind of the big party titles where a bunch of different characters came together. But Capcom vs SNK took that festive party atmosphere to the next level by transcending the company's boundaries. In many ways, it was like a dream game for me. It was nice seeing the characters that we had designed get reinterpreted by the people at Capcom. And as a game, too, I really loved it. At the time, it felt like the only way we could ever top this would be if we made truly Olympic scale fighting game. Something crazy like Sega versus Namco versus SNK versus Capcom. You have some editorial notes here. Prior to Capcom and SNK collaboration, Tanabe says he had other team members at SNK like the idea of a crossover game so much that they developed one themselves as a limited internal hobbyist project. That's pretty cool, actually. And then we have another quote here by Toyohisa Tanabe, the pixel art supervisor at SNK. I have a secret to tell you, and I don't know if this is something I really should be saying, but 2 years before Capcom vs SNK came out, we had made King of Fighters 98. And we actually had a little bit of time after we finished development. So the team ended up making a build of the game with Ryu and Ken in it. This isn't something that a lot of people know. I think only the developers know about it. And I've never told anyone myself. But yeah, just for fun, before Capcom vs SNK was a thing, I was playing as Ryu and Ken in King of Fighters 98. I doubt a version of it still exists anywhere. We did this on the development hardware, so of course it was never on a physical cartridge. Also, I'm just remembering this now, but it wasn't only Ryu and Ken that we ended up playing around with. We put in Dragon Ball characters, like Son Goku as well. Pretty sweet. We have some editorial notes right here. While Capcom vs SNK made headlines for its concept and Capcom released a upgraded version, Capcom vs SNK 2 Pro. Many say the series wasn't fully realized until Capcom released Capcom vs SNK 2 a year later. Featuring an expanded roster and more variety and polish, Capcom vs SNK 2 marked the series' turning point from a novelty to a tournament staple. And we have another quote by James Chen. When CVS 2 came out, that to me felt like this was the next great Street Fighter game, because they added all the grooves. CVS 1, if people don't remember, put players attack on 4 buttons, and that didn't feel very Street Fighter-y. And I know a lot of people didn't like that. And so when CVS 2 came out, and it went back to 6 buttons. I mean, I wrote FAQs for both of these games, and you can kind of see it in my FAQ for CVS 2. I just keep talking about the fact that it's 6 buttons again, and how wonderful it is. I was so happy that it was 6 buttons. And the graphics were so good, the gameplay was really solid in it. It really felt to me like this is where Street Fighter needs to go. In the FAQ itself, I'm like, you've got to play this game. Please play this game, because it's so good. Let's make this game popular, you know? I'm practically begging readers to play the game because I was so enamored with it at the time, and I just thought it was going to be the next big thing. Then we have a quote by Seth Killian, Street Fighter 4 Special Combat Advisor from Capcom USA. Compared to previous games, CVS 1 did offer a big cast and a lot of system choices, but most of the options presented were just bad choices. As players realized this, the result was long matches between low-powered characters filled with as many as 7 breaks between rounds. CVS 1 was not a bad game, but its slow, low-stakes style created a black hole where hype went to die. CVS 2 felt like a game that said yes to pretty much every dumb idea that designers suggested, and yet somehow made it all work. It was simultaneously traditional and wild. It returned to classic 2D Street Fighter style combat, but with a huge roster, the widest and wildest system mechanics in Capcom history, plus the chance to mix them all to taste. It returned to Capcom style 6-button controls, added an essential dose of extra moves. The match flow got tightened up, limiting players to 3 characters per team, but the system mechanics went bananas, offering players a choice of 6 entirely different flavors: C, A, and P grooves, as well as S, N, and K groove options. For each of their favorite characters, grooves didn't just swap super moves, they changed everything from defensive options on down to core movement mechanics. Combine that amount of choice with 48 characters and you've got a huge space for players to experiment and explore. And then we have some editorial notes here. Between CVS 1 and CVS Pro and CVS 2, Capcom released 3 crossover games in the span of a year. Former sales manager Drew Maniscalco estimates that Capcom sold 400 arcade kits of Capcom vs. SNK in the US, just above Street Fighter 3. As he recalls, Capcom vs. SNK 2 went on to become a hardcore favorite, appearing in tournaments well over a decade after its release. At the time, it sold well enough to justify a sequel, and it's still popular even today. We have a quote here by Hideki Itsuno. This is the CVS 2 director, Capcom Japan. Shortly after we finished Capcom vs. SNK 2, we started working on a 3D version of Capcom vs. SNK 3 for the PS2. CVS 3 was meant to be the last 2D fighting game, but then it ended up becoming a 3D game along the way. And then SNK folded, and that project got canceled too, which is unfortunate. So there's some editorial notes here. In 2003, following an acquisition and bankruptcy filing, a new incarnation of SNK under the name Playmore finally released its take on the crossover arcade fighting game concept SVC Chaos. The game redrew many of Capcom characters in King of Fighters style and featured a deep roster, including Dan from the Street Fighter Alpha series, who was originally designed to parody 2 SNK characters, but reviewed poorly and arrived too late to capitalize on the crossover buzz. In 2007, the company, by then SNK Playmore, followed with SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters DS, which also disappointed critics. Nishiyama left SNK well before either of those games released, but then when asked about the overall success of the crossover series, he sums it up as a modest success. We have a quote here by Takashi Nishiyama, head development group at SNK Japan. I don't think we failed in any regard, but I don't think that maybe the series wasn't quite as successful as I imagined it could be. I realize that SNK fans and Capcom fans don't have a high level of crossover. Capcom fans have their own preferences, SNK fans have their own preferences, and it didn't quite pan out the way I imagined it. I don't think it was a failure though. Though early rumors suggested otherwise, a Capcom SNK crossover didn't arrive on Neo Geo arcade hardware until SVC Chaos, which was in 2003, which you're seeing right here. Fun little fact, I remember back in the day when there was arcades, there was a SVC Chaos at my local arcade. But nobody played it. I mean, you'd barely see anyone play it. Everyone was playing Marvel vs. Capcom 2. CVS 2 came later, but I remember seeing it. They did come a little too late. But we're going to continue on to this article. Capcom Fighting All-Stars. As SNK went through changes in the early 2000s, its employees spread throughout the industry. Some started in new teams like Nishiyama, who formed development studio Dimps. A group even joined Capcom, bringing things full circle from when Nishiyama and the Street Fighter team had gone to SNK a decade earlier. And we have another quote here by Toyoisa Tanabe, Capcom Fighting All-Stars director at Capcom Japan. Basically, what happened was around the year 2000, SNK encountered financial losses, and there was a time when it became a subsidiary of a pachinko company named Aruze. So we ended up going to Aruze, but after about a year, Aruze decided that they were going to abandon video game development. So unable to see any future with Aruze, I ended up transferring to Capcom thanks to the help of a number of people around me. Someone I knew put me in contact with Yoshiki Okamoto, the head of development at Capcom. And thanks to both of their efforts, Capcom took me in. It was a team of about 20 people that ended up going to Capcom at the same time. There were more people than on the team at SNK, but unfortunately, Capcom couldn't bring everybody over. So the number had to be whittled down. So the 20 of us joined Capcom as a single team. I can't deny that there was some of that feeling of it being a bit strange. When the 20 of us joined Capcom, I think there were people who thought well of it. But there may also have been people who looked askance and thought, who the heck are these guys? For our part, as a team, we hadn't yet proven ourselves or accomplished anything, so there was a sense of anxiety about how well we'd fit in and what we'd be able to achieve there. Itsuno was really good to use us then. I don't get the chance to talk with him nowadays, but he treated us very well, and the presence of people like him at Capcom was a huge help for us. We have some editorial notes under that. The team's first and only project under its new roof was Capcom Fighting All-Star, a 3D fighting game that brought together characters from multiple internal franchises, including Street Fighter, Rival School, and Strider. Capcom ended up canceling the project before Tanabe's team finished it. We have a quote here by Toyoisa Tanabe, Capcom Fighting All-Star Director, Capcom Japan. There was a lot going on there. When we joined Capcom, there were two plans put forward for the kind of game we could develop. we had a lot of people on our team with experience developing fighting games, so our first idea was to make our own fighting game. However, creating a fighting game from scratch with a new gameplay system would have been very time consuming, and as a new team at Capcom, we felt we had to contribute something to the company as quickly as possible. So instead we went with our second idea, which was to use Capcom's pre-existing assets as the foundation for a new project. And that game, well, I can't really talk about too much, but that's how Capcom Fighting All-Stars development began. Unfortunately, we just weren't able to work it up into something interesting, partly due to my own inexperience. In the end, even though our staff did their best, the game never made it to release. And we have a quote by James Chen. I mean, everybody saw the footage of Capcom Fighting All-Stars, and it was kind of, even though it was their first official attempt to go 3D as an internally developed game using Street Fighter characters, a lot of people looked at it and were disappointed. I think that kind of contributed to the whole feeling that Capcom wasn't really going to make a lot of quality fighting games at that point in time. And people were just kind of resigned to say, yeah, okay, whatever. Capcom wasn't the best anymore at making fighting games. They just weren't, and that expectation wasn't there. I remember when Capcom Fighting All-Stars first started showing up with footage from game magazines and Japanese game sites, people just looked at it and were like, this looks kind of bad, you know? And so when it was canceled, I still kind of remember people just being like, yeah, it's probably for the better. So we have another quote by Toyoisa Tanabe, again, the Capcom Fighting All-Star director from Capcom Japan. Right after the time Capcom Fighting All-Stars was canceled, Capcom as a whole underwent an organizational change. I ended up leaving Capcom and joining its subsidiary, Flagship, a scenario and development team that Okamoto started. I worked at Flagship for several years. I wasn't involved with fighting games. I was involved with other titles that were in development in the studio at the time. And then we continue to the blog. Moving on. By the time it canceled Capcom Fighting All-Stars in 2003, Capcom had been slowing its fighting game output for years, dropping its custom CPS3 hardware, canceling games such as Fourth Entry in the Street Fighter 3 series, and pulling resources away from its arcade division. It continued to port existing titles to consoles and snuck out a couple of new games with Hyper Street Fighter 2 and Capcom Fighting Jam. Both built to capitalize on existing games and assets, but the genre was on borrowed time. Throughout the 90s, Capcom had pushed its arcade fighting game concepts into nearly every conceivable format. It had defined the genre, spun off upgrades, gone back in time, created new worlds, negotiated key licenses, hired external studios, tried new art styles, shifted hardware, combined franchises, twisted its franchise into other genres, joined forces with its enemies, and built some of the best video games of the decade. At a certain point, it was time to say goodbye. Here's a quote by Akira Yasuda, Street Fighter series illustrator from Capcom Japan. I think around the year 2000, Funamizu told people who were working on fighting games to basically stop working on fighting games. Let's make something original, and it doesn't matter if it sells or not. We should do it anyways. This is obviously talk from a long time ago, but you know Resident Evil, right? Tokuro Fujiwara, who had made Resident Evil, had at the same time also made a bunch of other relatively uninteresting games. But I think the reason why those games were made was because Fujiwara wanted to challenge his staff. I think Funamizu wanted to do something similar. Now that the old way of doing things was no longer working, I think he wanted to find a new style, a new way forward by challenging his staff. And it did provide some hints to the company's direction in a number of different ways. I think there was also people in the lowest level of the staff saying that Street Fighter is no longer selling, so we want to make something else that's not a fighting game. The Street Fighter Alpha series had been going on for a while, and everyone was bored of that. And it didn't sell very well either. So I think this felt like the moment to try something new and go after a new challenge. Funamizu was also a big fan of Animal Crossing, so I think he wanted to make something similar to Animal Crossing, which some way or another ended up becoming Monster Hunter. That's interesting. We have a quote here by Noritaka Funamizu, general producer of Capcom Japan. I don't know if I want to talk about it. By the late 90s, I was in charge of the arcade game division, but we knew there really wasn't a future in it going forward. And basically, it was just a question of how viable could this business remain in the foreseeable future. If you compared Capcom to Sega, Namco, and Taito, we were smaller than them, and they had other related businesses. They were major arcade game makers, but we were pretty much just a video game company at that point. So it felt like there was no future there. But then we heard about the Sega Dreamcast and the Naomi board, and we got along with the folks at Sega surprisingly well. And we at Capcom too wanted to focus on consumer games. With the Dreamcast and Naomi, you could develop the arcade game and the console ports concurrently. You could complete a console port in just 1 month, amazingly. So almost all of our projects became joint arcade/console projects, and gradually our development focus shifted to console-friendly games. We have a quote here by Hideki Itsuno, Capcom vs SNK 2 director of Capcom Japan. In terms of the environment at the time, the arcade business was starting to shrink. In terms of the technology, the arcade versions of a game had always been the higher form, the more technologically advanced versions, but around this time, the roles started to get reversed, and the technology on home console games started to surpass that of arcade games. So there was less of a need to focus on arcade games. We also had the emergence of platforms like the Dreamcast, where we need to simultaneously release the game on both home console and arcade. So the combination led to the dwindling of the dominance of arcade games. And on top of that, you had Resident Evil selling incredibly well. It was a huge success, and so it was a combination of, here's a non-fighting game that's incredibly successful, and then you have the arcade environment shrinking. There's not as much demand for it. All of that combined kind of created this shift. There wasn't as much of a demand or much of a business benefit just focusing on fighting games. There was more of a shift that was like, we should spread ourselves out and test the waters elsewhere. And then we have a quote from Toyoisa Tanabe from the Capcom Fighting All-Stars he's the director for that game at Capcom Japan. I think fighting games had slowly evolved into something for advanced players. In pros, it felt like the future of fighting games had become very uncertain. Let me read that. I think fighting games had slowly evolved into something for advanced players and pros. It felt like the future of fighting games had become very uncertain, and Capcom kept putting out games like Monster Hunter and Resident Evil games that didn't depend on Capcom fighting game franchises. So yeah, we got the sense that the time were changing. Something similar had happened before with shooting games, which became more and more difficult to the point that only advanced players could enjoy them. It felt like we were at a turning point with fighting games too. It definitely felt that way. I totally agree with that. So we have a quote here from Shinichiro Shinichiro Obata, Street Fighter 3 planner from Capcom Japan. I think the reason why fighting games stopped coming out around that time is because they pretty much stopped selling, and even the arcade market itself had declined to an extent. I think also it had something to do with the fact that former Mega Man producer Keiji Inafune became the most prestigious producer in the company, and it was under his direction that the company focused more on console games like Resident Evil and Mega Man. Of the arcade games, Capcom developed only the Gundam games were hits. And that's why they kept making those. All the arcade developers were told to join the profitable console lines. Games like Monster Hunter, Resident Evil, Mega Man, Monster Hunter continues to be a big hit today. But that game was created by the people from the arcade division. Yep, and Monster Hunter is very, very popular. It's even today. I think it sold the most units when you look at copies sold out of all the IPs they own. Matt Atwood, Public Relations Manager at Capcom USA. To some degree, you can tell the arcade story without talking about what else was going on at Capcom. And there was a lot of experimentation. Automata Lisa was completely out of the blue. You had stuff like Steel Battalion, Onimusha, and Dino Crisis. And they were getting into bass fishing games. Devil May Cry was one that may have signified. So it's interesting because Devil May Cry and its success may have sort of cemented the idea that the direction should be on other things. I think that was the first time they saw something beyond Resident Evil that was like, oh my god, this is really different, and we have the ability to create things that are so stylish and so different. I think all of the internal studios took notice, and I think that the resources were shifted there. James Chen again saying, at the point in time, it was just one of those things that, as a fan of the games, you just kind of accepted that it was dead. I remember when Capcom Fighting Jam first showed up at E3. A lot of people were surprised. They're like, wow, they're making a new game. And then everyone looked at me. I was like, why does this game look so darn ugly? And that was such a prevailing feeling. Capcom Fighting Jam came out and was at E3, and everyone was like, oh. Even then, nobody seemed like they were really hype about it. It just didn't feel like there was any hype for it. I just don't recall anyone seeing Capcom Fighting Jam and being like, oh my god, I can't wait to go to the arcade and try this out. And all that stuff. Literally, I just think everybody was like, whatever. At this point, we had all kind of just given up on hoping for a more quality Capcom fighting game. So we have another quote here by Toyoisa Tanabe, the Capcom Fighting All-Stars director. I don't know if I would use the word disappointed to describe that generational change, but in terms of the feelings that I experienced at the time with fighting games slowly winding down, I wondered, would the game industry itself begin to change over time? And how would we, as fighting game developers, weather this change? There was a sense of danger, but also of excitement. I also acknowledge that you can't expect a genre to continue on in the same way forever, right? But as someone who had experienced the energy and excitement of fighting game boom firsthand, which players of all skill levels took part in, I did think it was a bit sad that it was finally winding down. We have another quote here by Hideki Itsuno, CVS2 director, Capcom Japan. I wasn't sad at all. I felt like I did everything that I wanted to do in the 2D space. And then you had the emergence of new games like Monster Hunter, Automata Lisa, Devil May Cry 2, the JoJo games, the Resident Evil Outbreak. I was personally working on an RPG that eventually became Dragon's Dogma. I was excited to be working on an action RPG I also was able to take all of the knowledge that I had built up in the fighting game space and throw it in Devil May Cry 3. I realized that all the knowledge I had built up could be expanded into the action game genre as well. Then you have some photos here of Monster Hunter. Capcom's early 2000s shift away from fighting games happened shortly before the departure of two of the key figures responsible for its fighting game, Yoshiki Okamoto and Noritaka Funamizu. Funamizu says he left in part because of management skepticism over the development of the original Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter went on to become one of Capcom's most successful franchises, with 2018's Monster Hunter World selling more than 16 million copies, more than twice as many as Capcom's second most successful individual game. Moving on to the article, the future is now. The mid-2000s marked the end of an era for Capcom fighting games. Priorities had shifted. Key figures like Okamoto and Funamizu left Capcom and started their own studios. Capcom Japan sold the Street Fighter IP to Capcom USA. It marked a clean break, at least until 2008, when Capcom rebooted the series with Street Fighter 4, developed by Nishiyama's team at DIMPS. In the decade plus since then, Capcom has produced fighting games at a measured pace and primarily focused on known quantities, mainline Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom entries, and ports of old games. But for Itsuno, who currently works as one of Capcom's most successful directors, that doesn't mean we won't see anything else in the future. And we have a quote here by Hideki Itsuno, Devil May Cry series director at Capcom Japan. I haven't retired just yet. There is definitely a part of me that, I would love to eventually make Capcom vs. SNK 3. I actually have two ideas for one-on-one fighting games still lingering in my mind. It's more of just a matter of having the opportunity to do so. So if there's anyone that's willing to give me a development team and a nice budget, I'm more than willing to listen. And he laughs. Editorial notes here. Asked how likely it is he thinks he will return to work on another fighting game, given Capcom's current trajectory, Itsuno says he thinks there's a decent but far from confirmed chance. Well, we need to make that happen, that's for sure. And then he continues, every time I submit new concepts for creating a new game, there's always a fighting game in those concepts. It just so happens it's never been selected. But I would like to make at least one more fighting game before I retire. I don't know. In terms of percentages, maybe 30 to 50%. Something like that. And then that's where the article ends. So, really good article. Honestly, Capcom should give him, he already did Devil May Cry 5. And that's successful. And that game was fantastic. So they should do it, but I think we should rally, we should tell people to tweet on Twitter, on social media, get Capcom's attention. We need to let people know that, especially the people at Capcom, we need to let them know, and SNK, that we want this game. If we want Capcom versus SNK 3, we need to make some noise, essentially. We can't just sit by and twiddle our fingers and hope that something just drops in our lap. So we have to be a bit active, even streaming, playing CVS2. There are more people streaming CVS2, which is fantastic. But we have to be more open to the conversation, and we got to bring it up to Capcom's attention. So, but people have to play it, I think people will play it. You know, with the resurgence of King of Fighters 14, they just announced an Ultimate Edition that's coming out. I'm sure King of Fighters 15 would come out. Street Fighter 6 is already confirmed. We already know about it. I think it would be a fantastic time. It would kind of relive these moments, kind of like in the past, you know, where we had like we are like in a renaissance right now of fighting games, and that would be, you know, a nice cherry on top. You know, just like how we got the crossover series for Marvel vs. Capcom. You know, I'm definitely open for a Capcom versus SNK revival. It would be fantastic, especially with all the, you know, new players that are, you know, joining the groups. Whether it's, you know, it doesn't have to be Street Fighter. It could be Dragon Ball, Grand Blue Versus, you know, Killer Instinct. We have so many more groups, and people could be possibly interested in playing it. So, you know, you got Justin Wong playing, you know, CVS2. That guy's really good. You know, he streams. We just have to just collaborate all together and make some noise. I think it's very possible. But that was the article, guys, from Polygon. Really good article. I love the artwork. The artwork was done by Felipe Magana, right? That's his name. Yeah, really good article. I put it in the link, the source in the description, if you guys want to check it out. But that's literally the whole thing commentated for you guys. All right, so I will catch you guys later on the next stream. Thanks for joining. If you listened to that whole thing, shout outs to you. All right, guys, I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.